Snow had begun to fall in the late afternoon, starting with fine flakes drifting quietly like ashes of memory descending from the sky. By nightfall, the mountains of northern Montana were blanketed in thick white. Wind swept through the pine ridges like a sigh. No one was on the road, no engines, only the howling wind and the cold seeping through the rotting wooden seams of an old house perched alone on the slope. Inside the cabin, Thomas Hale sat before the fireplace, his eyes open but blind. He had lost his sight completely. A bomb disposal accident had extinguished the light from his world at the age of 33. Since then, life had become sound, sensation, and memories that no one could take away. Thomas had once been a Special Forces sergeant, leading a K-9 bomb squad in Iraq. It was not a job for the impatient or those of a weak constitution. He had lived each minute breathing in death, but also sensing life more vividly than most, because beside him was another pair of eyes, another soul, a dog named Echo. Echo, a German shepherd mix, his coat a misty silver-gray like mountain fog, his body lean but oddly resilient. Echo didn't need praise, didn't need treats, and never strayed more than a meter from Thomas when on duty. He wasn't just a military asset. He was eyes, a sixth sense, a survival instinct for the man who now walked blind. Once, in the desert, Thomas had lost direction after an explosion scattered his unit. Amid red dust and gunfire, it was Echo who gently tugged at his shirt, dragging him out of the danger zone, sprinting 400 meters through uncleared ground, never stopping once. Maybe that's why, when Echo disappeared during their final mission, Thomas could never accept that he had died. The report said, K-9 Echo did not return. Presumed KIA, a single cold line stamped onto paper. No one searched, no follow-up. The page of war was folded shut in haste, and when Thomas woke in the field hospital, blind, he only asked, "Where's Echo?" and received nothing but silence that has lasted to this day. After discharge, Thomas sold everything he owned in the city and moved to Montana, to a secluded plot near the woods, where no one visited, no one asked questions. He built a cabin with his own hands, installed solar panels, burned wood for heat, and learned to live using only his ears, his hands, and a white cane tipped with rubber. He didn't want pity, didn't need help. Every morning, he rose early, boiled water over the stove, and made coffee like he used to. He couldn't see the sunrise, but he could hear the birds of early season and feel the subtle shift in the wind's warmth. Sometimes he sat on the porch, his hand resting on a wooden picture frame, the only photo he'd kept from the battlefield. Him and Echo, standing side by side, mountains behind them, both facing the horizon. His fingers would trace the dog's ear in the photo, brushing over the faded lines. "You stood right here," he would whisper, "and sometimes I think I can still hear your footsteps." Yes, on certain nights, in thick snow and howling wind, he heard steps, not human, not heavy, but light, quick, even-paced, just like their patrols long ago. He had stood, opened the door, and listened, but it was only wind and snow. They said it was a hallucination, a sound echoing from memory, but Thomas believed some part of Echo, if still alive, was out there in the world trying to find his way back, and only Thomas, the blind man, could still hear what those with sight had long forgotten how to listen for. One day, a boy named Ben from the neighboring farm snuck past the fence, curious about the veteran living alone. He left a dog biscuit on the porch, then ran off. Thomas didn't see it, but he heard the wrapper hit the wooden floor. He only smiled. The next day, Ben asked, "Did you ever have a dog?" Thomas nodded. "What was his name?" Silence. Thomas turned his face toward the forest, where the wind howled like an ancient cry. "Echo," he said. "Do you think Echo will come back?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. He placed his hand over his heart. "If he's still alive, the snow will show him the way." And as if fate had been listening, on the eve of the next snowstorm, when all sounds are buried under ice, a low whimper rose from deep within the forest. faint, broken, like a final call for the one heart left in the world that still remembered his name. That night, the sky seemed frozen. No stars, not even a streak of light. The wind howled across the roof like a lost soul, stripping layers of snow off the eaves, whistling through the wooden cracks like the whisper of an unburied memory. Thomas sat slumped in his armchair by the fire, one hand holding a cup of coffee gone cold, the other resting on his knee in silence. In the dim brown room, only the crackle of burning logs and the wind tapping against fogged glass remained. He was used to silence. Silence had been his survival since light left him. But tonight, it wasn't quite whole. Somewhere out there, in the snow-buried forest, came a strange sound. Very soft, very faint. Not wind, not night birds, not wild animals. It sounded like a whimper, intermittent, lost, the sound of life slipping away but still clinging desperately to the world. Thomas sat up straight, his whole body tightening as every sense funneled into his hearing. A normal person wouldn't tell the difference. But Thomas, who had survived war zones by locating sound in the dark, heard it. A hoarse whimper, like from a frozen throat. A tight knot formed in his chest. A cry for help, strangled by snow. A dog. His heart raced, but his steps were steady. He stood, grabbed his thick coat, took up his cane, and tapped the wall lightly. 3 small knocks on wood, a private ritual before stepping out into the world. He opened the door. The wind knifed into him with biting cold, but he didn't flinch. He stepped out, one hand sweeping the snowy ground with his cane, the other held to the air, listening for subtle changes in silence. And then he walked. Not because he knew the way, but because his heart had heard what eyes could not see. Step by step, he moved along the edge of the woods, snow up to his knees. The cane tapped tree trunks, iced rocks, and hard earth, then stopped. The whimper came again, closer now, clearer but weaker. Thomas dropped to his knees, his hand dug through the snow, brushing it aside layer by layer, until his skin touched something that wasn't snow or stone. Fur, wet, cold, shivering. His heart clenched. His hand ran over a small, bony body, ribs protruding matted coat. He reached the neck, an old, rusted metal collar. He froze, etched on the tag. Barely legible. Echo. K90872. Time stopped. Snow still fell, wind still screamed, but inside Thomas there was silence. He didn't need to see, didn't need proof. His ears remembered that rasping breath. His fingers felt the familiar scar on the left shoulder, where Echo had once been grazed by shrapnel in 2012. His heart knew for sure. The dog, limp and barely alive in his arms, was Echo. "I'm here," Thomas whispered, voice choking. Echo didn't move, but his eyes, though shut, twitched slightly, as if recognizing the warmth pressed against him. In the freezing dark, Echo's breath synced faintly with the chest of the blind soldier from long ago. Thomas leaned down, gently lifted him, cradling the frail body close like a lost piece of soul come home. He turned, not by sight, but by retracing his steps back through the snow. That night, beneath the white-blanketed forest, a blind soldier carried in his arms the dog thought long gone, walking slowly through the biting wind as if they had never been apart. The door closed behind them, shutting out the howling wind and the blinding white snow like a gate slamming shut between 2 worlds. On one side, a cold and indifferent forest. On the other, something still clinging to life. Thomas stood still for a moment, feeling every shallow, fragile breath from the creature in his arms. A breath that shouldn't exist, yet it did. He knelt by the fireplace, wrapped Echo tightly in his thick coat, and quickly tossed more logs onto the dying fire. Flames flared back to life, casting long shadows of 2 shivering figures, man and dog, huddled together like lost souls who had just escaped the edge of death. Thomas laid Echo gently on an old wool rug near the fire, covering him with the heavy blanket usually saved for bitter winter nights. But the soaked fur refused to hold warmth. Without hesitation, he removed his gloves, knelt close, and with bare hands began drying every part of the dog's frail body. Echo's fur was matted, clumped with frozen mud, stiff in places like stone. Thomas felt every small wound, every blistered patch from frostbite, every raw cut hidden beneath the silver-turned yellow coat. The paws, once firm and fearless along war fronts, were now swollen, cracked, and some toes dark with frost. But what stopped Thomas cold was the chain. A rusted steel length over a meter long still latched around Echo's neck, embedded deep into the skin. It wasn't a military lead. It was a cheap chain, crudely twisted with steel wire, fastened to an old leather collar. He exhaled sharply, fists clenched. Who did this? Who could be so cruel as to bind a war dog, a K9 who gave his youth and his body to duty, to a frozen nowhere in the middle of a snow-laden forest with no food, no escape? How long had Echo been there? A night? 2? Or had he spent endless days breathing in ice and darkness, waiting for something no one believed would come? Thomas leaned in, trembling fingers touching the collar, where a small rusted tag was still attached. He traced the faded engraving not with sight, but with memory etched into his very skin. Echo, K9 0872. A simple line, but enough to crack open everything inside the blind soldier. There was no more doubt. This was him. He hadn't just survived, he had come home. He called softly, only once. Echo. And like a miracle, one soft ear twitched. Barely a movement, subtle enough to be mistaken for a spasm. But to Thomas, it was a nod, a response, a soul's answer. Thomas removed the chain with bare hands, not waiting for warm water, not reaching for tools. He unraveled each twisted knot by touch alone, as if dismantling a trap wrapped tight around his own heart. Beneath the rust, Echo's neck revealed deep grooves, skin bleeding. But the dog didn't resist. He lay still, breathing weakly, as though he knew, for the first time in years, these hands would not hurt him. When the last link dropped to the wooden floor with a chilling clink, Thomas let out a breath and pressed his forehead to the dog's. He whispered, "No more chains, no more orders. No one owns you now. You're free, Echo." He grabbed a clean cloth, warmed it by the fire, and continued, drying each toe, cleaning each paw, soothing each swollen patch. In every inch of skin, he rediscovered familiar landmarks, a crescent scar on the left shoulder, a patch of fluffier fur on the right cheek, the subtle shiver Echo always made when touched at the base of his neck. He hadn't changed, but time had taken much. Muscle gone, fur thinned, bones jutting beneath dry skin. And still, he found his way back. Thomas didn't know what Echo had been through, who had chained him. Why? How many forests had he crossed? How many days had he wandered without food? How many nights so cold they had numbed his consciousness? He didn't know. But he knew one thing. Echo had never forgotten. And he had chosen to come back, not with sight, not with a map, but by memory, by the scent of pine wood, by the warmth that still lingered in this wooden cabin, by the invisible thread connecting two souls who once shared the same battlefield. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He sat beside Echo for hours, continuing to warm him, dry him, wrap him in heated towels, and drip water slowly into his mouth. Sometimes Echo shivered, letting out a long sigh like the final gust of wind at the end of a storm. His eyes remained shut, but the faint twitch of his eyelids suggested dreams. Perhaps dreams of coming home. Each time it happened, Thomas would place his hand over Echo's chest and whisper, "I'm here. This isn't a dream. You're home." And he believed, with all his heart, that some part of Echo could hear him. Outside, The snow kept falling, thicker, colder, but inside that small room, beneath layers of wool and the soft flicker of firelight, a life rescued from the frost was breathing once again, faintly, delicately, but truly alive. And the blind soldier, the man who had lost all light, felt, for the first time in years, a flicker of warmth in his heart. He didn't need eyes to witness a miracle. All it took was a single touch, and a heart that still remembered a name. The fireplace blazed with new flames, crackling gently within the quiet of the rustic wooden cabin. The scent of burning wood mingled with the damp fur and faint breath of the dog curled tightly under a blanket. Thomas sat close, one hand resting gently on Echo's forehead, the other wrapping a warm cloth around the dog's body, like he was trying to pour his heartbeat into the frail frame, to breathe life back with the warmth of his soul. Echo remained still, save for the slight rise and fall of his chest, his breath dissolving into the cold air in thin, fragile layers. But that was enough. As long as Echo was breathing, Thomas could keep holding on to hope. There was no need for open eyes, no need for light. From the shapes beneath his fingertips, the soft, matted fur, the small scar on the shoulder, the sharp bones under starved skin, Thomas knew, with absolute certainty, this was Echo. Not because of the collar, not because of the scars, but because his heart recognized that rhythm of breath, because something inside him, something that had lived, died, and waited for years in silence, was finally stirring awake. Time seemed to slow beside Echo. In the amber glow of the fire, Thomas could feel each minute out quietly, like drops of memory soaking into the walls of the room. He remembered clearly the times they had lain like this, at outposts in the mountains or in bunkers in the desert. Back then, Echo always liked to rest his head on Thomas's leg, let out a soft sigh, and close his eyes, a small, perfect sign of absolute trust. And now, even after being chained, buried in snow, and starved, despite a world that had moved on, Echo was here again, once more leaning gently against him. That faint tilt of the head, clumsy and weak, was a nod from the soul. "You're here." Thomas raised his hand to his closed eyes, brushing over the lids that no longer saw, as if thanking the darkness for teaching him to feel with his heart instead. Had he still had his sight? Perhaps he would have been blinded by Echo's battered appearance, the dirty coat, the sunken eyes. But within his blindness, he saw the one thing that had never changed: love. He whispered Echo's name throughout the night, not to call him, but to remind them both. "We still have each other." Each time he said it, Echo stirred just slightly, like an old door creaking beneath a gentle knock. Thomas didn't rush him, didn't expect him to awaken fully. He knew life doesn't return in flames, but in embers, tended breath by breath, minute by minute, with each tender touch. At times, Thomas closed his eyes, his hand resting on Echo's chest, and it felt as though his own heart had synced with the dog's. A fragile, uneven beat, but persistent. It was no longer a connection between man and animal, but between two survivors, two souls abandoned by war, now found again in the cold of night. Near dawn, as the first pale blue light slipped through the curtain, Thomas heard a breath. Long, heavy, real. Echo shifted. His head rose slowly, only slightly, then dropped gently back down onto Thomas's foot. It was the first movement since the rescue. A small, hazy effort, weak, but enough to bring tears to Thomas's throat. "Don't push yourself," he murmured, his fingers tracing a line down Echo's muzzle. "Just rest. I'm here." Echo didn't respond, but in the breath that followed there was something warmer, no longer cracked like before, no longer broken by despair, as if simply knowing someone was still there, allowed life to return. That night, Thomas didn't sleep, and perhaps Echo didn't either. They simply lay there, a blind man and a dog on the brink, saying nothing, seeing nothing, relying only on the rhythm of breath to know, even in ruin, they were whole. And when the first birds of the season called from the pines, the first sound of morning after the snowstorm, Thomas smiled. The sun had not yet risen. The air was still cold. But in that small house, two old warriors had found each other again, through a touch that crossed time, war, betrayal, and even death. The next morning, as the first sunlight filtered through snow-draped pine branches, Thomas pulled on his thickest coat, carefully placed Echo into a blanket-lined basket, and made his way down the icy steps. The snow was still thick, the path slick, but he was used to walking in darkness. His wooden cane tapped familiar rhythms, but this time he wasn't walking alone. He was carrying something miraculous, still breathing beside him. He didn't own a car, but the nearest town lay only about 3 kilometers down the mountain, and he was willing to walk. Not because he needed help, but because he needed to prove to himself, and maybe to the world, that what he carried was real. The veterinary clinic smelled of antiseptic and echoed faintly with the tapping claws of nervous pets. The waiting room was lit, a few people already seated, a woman with a cat in her tote, a boy with a trembling beagle, and Dr. Emily, who had once treated Echo many years ago. She spotted Thomas from across the room. Everyone knew the blind veteran who lived deep in the woods. She smiled politely. "Thomas, what have you got there? Found a stray?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He set the basket gently on the exam table, slowly pulled back the blanket, and revealed the frail figure within. Labored breathing, drooping ears, and fur rising unevenly along old scar lines. "This is Echo," he said, his voice low, like he was speaking to his soul. Emily froze for a moment. Then she stepped forward, her expression shifting into professional focus, a small furrow on her brow. "Thomas, I remember that name. But Echo died. 5 years ago, after the ambush in Fallujah. You said so yourself." "Yes, I thought he was dead." Thomas nodded, fingers gently resting on Echo's head. But he came back. She leaned down, checking Echo's ears, eyes, teeth, and the old scars. Some details made her hesitate, especially the horseshoe-shaped scar behind the left shoulder, a mark few dogs would share. But eventually, she shook her head. "Could just be a coincidence. German shepherds all look alike to some extent. This one's wild, severely malnourished, paws worn raw from ice, eyes infected. No one would treat a canine like this. Are you sure?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He sat beside the table, tilted slightly, reached for Echo's snout, and placed a finger on his forehead, the exact spot they used to touch after every mission. And in that moment, something happened. Echo opened his eyes. Not wide, just a slit. But through those swollen lids came a gaze Thomas knew, one that had followed him through long marches, had glinted in the firelight of foxholes, had once snarled in defense of his life. It was a look both brave and patient, deeper than any language. Emily instinctively stepped back half a pace. "Did you see something?" she asked, then realized her misstep. Thomas couldn't see, but Thomas just smiled. "I don't need to see," he whispered. I heard it in his eyes. The room fell silent. An older man in the back shook his head slowly. "Probably just a stray. This mountain's full of shepherds. Echo's a common name." A young woman murmured to her husband. "Poor man. Probably just his imagination. Old folks bond with animals like that sometimes." Emily glanced around, then wheeled over a small blood pressure monitor to check Echo's vitals. But Echo, sensing something, turned his head toward Thomas, his gaze now clearer, stronger, drawn by the sound of a familiar voice. Then he let out a whimper. Not loud, not distinct, but deep, slow, from some cavern within, like a broken greeting after a long, lost journey. Thomas reached forward, rested his forehead against Echo's, just like they used to. "Only he makes that sound," Thomas said softly. "Only Echo whimpers like that when he hears my voice. I slept on battlefields hearing that every night. No one can fake that. There's no dog like him. There's only Echo." Emily said nothing. She stepped back and watched the two soldiers, one blind, unwavering in his belief, the other dying, still straining for the voice he trusted most. In that moment, she was no longer a veterinarian, but simply a witness to something beyond medicine, beyond logic. She whispered, "Maybe it is him." Thomas didn't reply. He lowered his head, gently kissed Echo's forehead, and spoke a vow no one else could hear. "You kept your promise. Now it's my turn." The wooden cabin sat quiet beneath the snowy forest night, broken only by Echo's steady, shallow breathing from the corner, where Thomas had placed a soft mattress by the fireplace, layered with 2 wool blankets and warm cloths regularly rotated to hold the heat. After a long day of IVs, joint massages, and spoon-fed broth, Echo could now lift his head, if only slightly. Thomas sat in a wooden chair by the window, his fingers moving across the raised dots of a braille keyboard. Before him was a screen reader device he had learned to use after losing his sight. Every word spoken by the small speaker near his ear was received with undivided attention, because somewhere within those lines might lie the key to the mystery he now had to face. Why was Echo, his friend, his fellow soldier, the one who shielded him from death, left alone to die in the snow like an abandoned stray? He started with the one thing burned into his mind: K90872. The serial number engraved on Echo's collar, encoded on every military document related to him. He launched the military K9 archive software, a stripped-down version he used during active duty, now voice-enabled for the blind. The mechanical voice spoke, slowly and clearly. K90872, status, decommissioned. His chest tightened. The voice continued, emotionless. Note, transferred July 23rd to non-military civilian entity, Bastion Corporation. Purpose, protection of non-military assets at sensitive materials storage site. Service period, 3 months. Termination, November of the same year. Final note, no longer operational, left on site. A blast echoed in Thomas's mind. He let go of the keyboard, his other hand gripping the armrest until his knuckles turned white. He sat frozen. Those emotionless lines, each note, each update, cut like knives, no longer operational, left on site, not a machine, not a piece of junk, but a living being, a soldier, a loyal soul who had crossed hell and back with him, who had licked his wounds, kept night watch beside his trench, tossed out like broken gear. He leaned over, trembling fingers reaching for his headset, replaying the audio again and again. Each time, the words hit harder. Civilian transfer chemical depot left on site. Echo hadn't died in the war. He had been taken, used like a tool, and when he was hurt, he was discarded without so much as a backward glance. Thomas gasped, his throat tightening, not from anger, but from the weight of a second loss. The first had been the news that Echo had died in an ambush. This time it was the truth that he had lived and been betrayed. He reached for the landline, still functional through the forest's fixed line, and called Davis, an old comrade who had once handled K9 logistics. After a few rings, the line clicked on. "Thomas?" "Yeah. I need your help." Thomas's voice had hardened. He read Echo's serial number aloud, then explained what the software had revealed. Davis was silent for a few seconds. "Yeah, I remember that. Back then, a few K9s were decommissioned after big ops. The military didn't want to cover the cost of care or rehab, so they contracted out to civilian security firms. Bastion Corp? That's them. They took in a few dogs, used them to guard warehouses full of classified junk and sensitive material. The place was in the middle of the desert. No power, no people. Cheap, dangerous, and completely off the radar. Each word fell into Thomas's chest like slabs of stone. "You mean no one ever checked on them?" "It wasn't on any official record. I once saw a shepherd come back with nearly all its claws gone. But who's going to sue them? Dogs can't talk. Dogs can't talk." That sentence carved itself into Thomas's spine. Because Echo couldn't speak, people had simply ignored his life. And when he collapsed in the snow, No one came. No one remembered, except Thomas. He hung up, stood slowly, and walked toward Echo. The dog was asleep, restless, occasionally curling in reflex, like an animal used to being jolted awake by violence. Thomas knelt beside him, reaching for the middle of his forehead, the spot he had always touched during war to let Echo know. "I'm still here," he whispered. "Echo." Echo opened his eyes, weak, hazy, but deep within the pupils a familiar glint returned. The same look from years ago. A look reserved for one person. A look that only appeared when he felt completely safe. A look that said, "I made it home." Thomas whispered, "They abandoned you, but I didn't. And I never will." That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He opened a file, recorded everything he had uncovered, and began to build a plan to trace Bastion Corp., to find the name on the transfer order, the location of the chemical depot and the people responsible, not for revenge, but for justice, for the loyal souls forgotten by the system. Echo hadn't died. He had survived, on instinct, on memory, and on a love strong enough to lead him back. And now, from the darkest place, the two soldiers would step into the light together to speak for those who cannot speak, and to stand for the ones who were chained and forgotten. Night wind whistled through the old pine trees, sighing between snow-laden trunks like whispers from unburied memories. Inside the warm cabin, Thomas sat still beside Echo, his hands resting lightly on the silver-gray fur slowly coming back to life in the soft firelight. Echo was breathing deeper now, more steadily, but each time his body curled in sleep, Thomas could feel the echoes of some nightmare still clinging to him, as if Echo was still fleeing from a ghost that had locked him in fear, in ice, in silence. Outside, the snow fell quietly and ceaselessly until an unusual sound broke through. 3 knocks on the wooden door. Thomas tilted his head, his grip on the cane tightening. He could hear the hesitation in those knocks, not the uncertainty of a stranger, but the heaviness of someone bearing guilt. The door opened, and with the rush of cold air came the scent of old cigarettes, worn leather, and memory. "Thomas," a voice said, deep, rough, and all too familiar. Thomas didn't need to ask. He recognized the man from the weight of his steps, the slight hitch in his breath when he saw Echo, and most of all, the silence between 2 people who already knew the truth. It was Richard Mallory, the former captain of the Special Forces unit that Thomas and Echo once served. He had once given the final orders before every deployment, the man who lit the flame of trust in soldiers who never asked why, only when. Now he stood hunched, hair graying, face more hollow than the darkness outside, carrying something even time couldn't lighten. "I didn't come expecting welcome," he said, "but I had to come." Thomas didn't answer. He nodded slightly, stepped back, and gestured toward the wooden chair across the fire. Echo, though still weak, lifted his head, ears low, eyes narrowing, but he didn't bark. Only a deep exhale escaped him, as if echoing the man's burden. "You know already," Richard said after a long pause. "The files. Bastion. All of it." "Not all of it," Thomas replied, his voice calm. But that calmness was sharper than any blade. "Not until you say your part." Richard sighed. He rubbed his crow's-footed eyes, as if trying to erase a memory that wouldn't fade. "That day, after the ambush, all we found was part of a dog's body under rubble, mixed into the debris. A different dog. Not Echo. But everyone believed he'd died. And I didn't correct them." Thomas turned toward the fire, listening. "If I'd said Echo was alive," Richard went on, "they would have asked, 'Where is he? Why wasn't he brought back? Why didn't the unit search for him?' And you chose the easy way out," Thomas whispered. "Yes. I signed the missing in action report. I helped close the file to keep everything clean. The unit was falling apart. Some died. Others were under investigation. And me?" His voice cracked. "I chose the shortest path, to protect the unit's name, to protect my rank." Thomas said nothing. But Echo sat up. He stared straight at Richard, not barking, not growling, just staring, and that look made the old man shudder. He lowered his head, gripping the seat beneath him. "I haven't slept in years," he murmured. "Not for the dead, but for the one I denied." After a long silence, Thomas finally asked, "Why come to me now?" "I didn't come for forgiveness," Richard said, eyes fixed on the fire, as if searching for a soul lost somewhere in its flames. "I just wanted Echo to know. I remembered him. That I regret what I did, even if it was cowardly." Thomas reached down, placing a hand gently on Echo's head. "Do you know? Out of all people, he came back to me, while you, the one who signed him away, have lived in peace all these years?" Richard stayed silent. A single tear rolled unexpectedly down his cheek. Not a tear of weakness, but the first tear from a man who once believed he could bury every emotion beneath discipline and uniform. Thomas slowly closed his eyes. His hand rested gently on Echo, and he asked, not just the dog, but perhaps himself, "What do you think, Echo? Should we forgive a traitor?" Echo, almost as if he understood, moved toward Richard. He walked slowly, unsteady from weakness, one step at a time, until he stood right at the man's feet. For a brief moment his eyes met the gaze full of regret, then dropped. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't anger. It was the exhaustion of a soul that had endured too much. Echo lowered his head to the floor, right next to Richard's boots, as if to say, "I'm no longer angry, but I don't have the strength to hate either." Richard let out a quiet sob, bending down, his hand trembling as he placed it gently on Echo's head, for the first time in years, touching the dog he had once deployed, once sent into battle, and ultimately, once betrayed. "Thank you," he whispered, "for surviving, even though I didn't deserve it." Thomas watched the scene, the firelight flickering across his face. The anger in his heart hadn't vanished, but he saw something clearly in that glow. True remorse doesn't erase wrongdoing, but it can be a place to start. And sometimes forgiveness doesn't arrive through words, but through a silence that is allowed to exist. That night, Richard walked away into the falling snow alone, just as he had lived for years. And inside the wooden cabin, Echo remained by Thomas's side, his head resting once again on Thomas's leg. One more time, despite human failures and frailty, that dog chose to believe in the faint light still flickering inside the heart that once betrayed him. The door clicked shut behind Richard Mallory, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt like the universe itself had exhaled. Outside, snow continued to fall on the tracks he left behind. Deep, unsteady, carrying the weight of a guilt no one had accused him of, but one he could never shake. Inside the cabin, the fire glowed gently, lighting Thomas's face, strangely calm in the wake of everything that had just been confessed. He stood by the door, his blind hands quietly gripping the cane. But in his chest, where no eyes could reach, his heart trembled with conflicting pulses. Forgiveness was never easy. Forgiveness was not forgetting. Sometimes, forgiveness meant standing in front of someone who had pushed another soul into the deepest kind of pain, and still choosing to open your heart, not because they deserved it, but because you needed to let go. Just before Richard left, Thomas had held his hand, an old hand, cold and shaking like someone who'd wandered in a blizzard for years and finally found shelter. "I forgive you," Thomas said, his voice no louder than a breath. "Not because you didn't do wrong, but because I won't let hatred destroy what's left of me." The old man nearly collapsed at those words, but Thomas bent down and touched Echo, who lay beside them, his eyes half open, half closed, as if watching the world through the rhythm of his breathing. "But Echo," Thomas said slowly, like each word tapped gently on pain, "hasn't forgiven." The room fell quiet. Echo didn't react. He didn't bark, didn't turn his head, didn't lift a paw, but that silence rang louder than any cry, not because he didn't understand, but because the wound was too deep to speak with a wag or a lick. That dog had lain in snow for days, with a rusted chain and frozen body, perhaps waiting, hour by hour, for someone to come back. But no one did. Not a voice he knew. Not the hand that once reassured him. And the worst part wasn't the frost. It was dying slowly from hope. Thomas knew that better than anyone. He saw it in how Echo flinched when strangers entered, in the way his eyes often looked up toward the ceiling, as if waiting for a familiar sound, in the sudden tremors, the midnight growls in dreams. Forgiveness doesn't come from logic. It comes from the heart, and Echo's heart had once been shattered. That evening, after Richard left, Thomas added more wood to the fire. It crackled warmly, casting a red glow on Echo's silver coat, now beginning to shine again. Echo curled up, his head resting on Thomas's leg, breathing lighter than the first night, but still shivering at every gust against the door. Thomas stroked his head gently. "You don't have to forgive today," he said. "No one has the right to ask you to forget anything." Echo lifted his head slightly, his gaze settling on the space before him. Thomas couldn't see it, but he felt it. A gaze round, deep, and weary, like a once clear lake now cloaked in mist. "Maybe one day," Thomas whispered, "you won't remember his name. But that doesn't mean the pain is gone, and I'll never ask you to forget what you endured to survive." Echo didn't answer, but he didn't turn away. That small act, quiet, simple, was enough for Thomas to understand. "I hear you. I understand. And I'm still here." That night, as Thomas sat beside Echo, recording pieces of his journal as he had since going blind, he said a sentence that would later echo far and wide, like a message etched into stone. "Forgiveness is not overlooking. It's not forgetting. It's looking the one who hurt you in the eye and saying, 'You no longer control my pain.' But the dog beside me, he has no words, no protest, no way to claim justice, so I will speak for him." Echo sighed, and Thomas could feel the faint warmth of relief pass through that fragile body. In that moment, a small piece of forgiveness began, not from Richard, not from Thomas, but from Echo's heart, a heart still scarred, but finally, quietly, starting to believe again. The next morning, the snow had stopped falling, leaving behind a world blanketed in white outside the window, pure, as if no pain had ever touched it. In the pale light of dawn, Thomas sat quietly beside Echo, his hand brushing the edge of a freshly filled water bowl, still warm. The cabin was silent, but not still, because wherever life is returning, there are always subtle sounds. The deeper breath after a night's rest, the soft footsteps that no longer hesitate, and sometimes the pounding of a heart just before fate arrives. It came suddenly, as it always did, the first seizure in months. Thomas was near the stove, about to refill the kettle, when his hand began to tremble. He froze, unable to brace himself in time. His body collapsed onto the wooden floor with a heavy thud. The kettle slipped from his grip, crashing against the table's edge with a harsh metallic clang, a sound that might have seemed like a simple accident to an outsider. But to Echo, it was a signal etched into his very being. In a fraction of a second, Echo sprang to life. No more tremors, no sluggishness of a recovering body. Strength surged back into him. His ears perked. His eyes locked on Thomas, now convulsing, limbs stiffening, breath shallow and erratic. He needed no command, no call. Echo bolted towards the old wooden cabinet, the third drawer on the left. Exactly that drawer, where Thomas always kept his emergency seizure medication. The drawer had a latch, but Echo, relying on an instinct that had never left, pressed his paw against the corner, then nudged the wooden catch with his nose. It popped open. He sifted through the contents with care. No panic, no mess. His front paws held the drawer steady while his muzzle moved swiftly, precisely, until it found the small brown medicine bottle. Echo gripped it gently between his teeth, turned, and ran to Thomas, placing it right beside his outstretched hand. He didn't leave. He didn't bark. He simply licked Thomas's face. Soft, steady licks, exactly as he had done in the trenches. Just like the first time Thomas had been hit by shrapnel in Afghanistan, lying unconscious after an explosion. It was Echo who had found him in the dust, brought him his meds, and stayed until his pulse steadied. Now, in the cold wooden cabin, he repeated that same act. No need for praise, no need for proof, because he was Echo. Minutes passed. Thomas's breathing began to slow. His eyes remained closed, but the tremors eased like the tide pulling away from the shore. His hand searched weakly until it brushed something familiar. The bottle, damp with saliva and cold earth. And then, warm fur. And that unmistakable scent. Echo. Thomas didn't need to ask what had happened. He didn't need to see. He just whispered, voice choked with gratitude. You remembered. Echo let out a soft whine, as if to confirm. Then he rested his head on Thomas's chest, closed his eyes. He didn't move. He didn't panic. He knew the mission was complete. That afternoon, once Thomas had recovered, he pulled Echo close and held him tight. You don't have to prove anything anymore, Echo, he whispered, hands trembling as they stroked the dog's neck. Even if no one believes, I do. I've always known it was you, not because of your number or your eyes, but because only you could save me like that. He switched on his voice recorder, his tone thick with emotion. Today, I nearly died. For the second time in my life, the one who saved me wasn't a person but a dog who was once deemed worthless, discarded, buried alive in snow. But today he came back, not just to live, but to save me again. This isn't a miracle. This is memory, instinct, and love from a four-legged soldier. From that moment on, no one could deny it. No DNA test, no military papers, no shouting to prove his worth. One simple act held everything. The past, the promise, the bond that would never break. And in that little wooden cabin, for the first time in years, Thomas smiled as he poured tea into 2 porcelain cups. One for himself, and one for the dog by the fire. His old comrade, the friend who never betrayed him, the living proof of a miracle the world had tried to forget. After that morning, when Echo opened the drawer and brought him the medicine, Thomas never saw his cabin the same way again. He was still blind, still feeling each step with his cane. But something inside had shifted, as if the cabin itself had come back to life, not through words, but through the quiet rhythm of a being once bonded to it down to his very breath. No one retrained Echo. No commands, no drills, no cues. But that morning, as Thomas slipped on his coat to step onto the porch, Echo stood up from the rug without waiting for a signal. He walked quietly to Thomas's left side, just half a step behind, exactly as he once had, in the dusty war zones where every step could have been their last. Thomas froze in the cold wind. His cane touched the porch's edge, but he didn't move forward right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and smiled. A soft, warm smile. No words were needed. No checking. Just by the breath beside him. He knew. Echo had returned to his place, not just in the cabin, but in his life. From that day, the cabin followed a new rhythm. Or rather, an old rhythm awakened from memory. Every time Thomas turned on the kettle, Echo would leave his spot, come sit quietly by his leg, not interfering, not begging, just waiting. When the water boiled, that once quiet sound that used to signal movement at field hospitals. Echo would retreat to lie under the table, right where Thomas used to sit reading raised maps. No one reminded him. No sign was given. The reflexes simply came back, as if they had never left. One morning, Thomas dropped his cane while walking from the kitchen to the door. Before he could bend down, Echo had already picked it up, carried it back, and laid it gently in his hand. Not with the eagerness of a pet playing fetch, but with the solemnity of a ritual, as if saying, "You need this to keep going." Thomas sat down, gripping the cane, then touched Echo's neck. He didn't speak. He just left his hand there longer than usual. A quiet answer. One afternoon, while checking the rain trough behind the cabin, Echo moved ahead a few steps. He turned back, standing firmly at the last porch step. Thomas paused, sensing something different in the air. "Is something wrong?" he asked softly. Echo didn't whine, didn't budge. He just stood like a silent wall between his blind partner and an unseen threat. When Thomas tapped forward with his foot, he felt it. A slick layer of ice, more dangerous than he'd guessed. He chuckled gently. "All right, you win. I'll go back." Echo waited until he was safely inside. His eyes scanned the space ahead like a soldier on watch. No barking, only vigilance, devotion, and a love that needed no explanation. At night, in the firelight, Thomas sat on the bench reading a Braille book while Echo lay quietly at his feet. When Thomas lifted his hand from the page, reaching for his cane, it was already there. Echo had placed it beside him. Thomas didn't smile, didn't gasp. He simply sighed, not out of weariness, but from the emotion too vast for words. He turned on his voice recorder, a habit since losing his sight, and said, "He doesn't need to relearn anything. Echo is simply remembering every habit, every rhythm, every breath I've ever taken. And he's not remembering with his mind, but with his heart. When he walks on my left, I don't feel blind anymore. I feel led by something greater than sight, a light I've never known how to name." Echo didn't respond. But when Thomas turned off the recorder and rested his head on the pillow, Echo left his spot and quietly jumped onto the foot of the bed, right where he used to sleep when they were stationed at the border base. Thomas didn't tell him to get down. He turned to face him, reached toward his neck. Echo shifted, just enough so that if anything happened, he would know first. No words were spoken, only steady breathing of two survivors, learning again how to be man and dog, as if they had never lost anything at all. A few days after Echo resumed sleeping on Thomas's bed like the old nights at the military outpost, the quiet wooden cabin received a new kind of sound, the crisp, gentle crunch of small boots on snow. At first, Thomas only sensed it in the way the wind broke differently. Light footsteps, not clumsy but curious, circling the front porch. Echo sprang up from behind the chair. His ears stood alert, his back arched. No growling, but his gaze turned sharp, a blade unsheathed. Thomas listened carefully, then smiled softly. "Not a wild animal. Those steps are for a child. Software curious." He steadied himself with his cane and stepped outside. The cold wind hit his face, but the warmth inside followed him through the door. Echo walked beside him, left side, half a pace behind. Now a natural reflex. As the door opened, a small voice rose, tangled in the wind. "I don't mean to bother. I just wanted to see the dog." A moment of hesitation. Echo didn't bark. He stood between Thomas and the boy. He didn't advance, but he didn't back down either. Thomas frowned, tilting his head. "You must be Ben, right? From the house down the hill?" The boy nodded, then remembered the man couldn't see, and quickly replied, "Yes, sir, I'm Ben. I saw you the other day walking with a big gray dog. I've never seen a dog stay that close to someone before." Thomas smiled. "That's Echo. He's not just a dog. He's a soldier." Ben didn't fully grasp the weight of those words, but his eyes, clear, curious, were locked on Echo, who stood like a statue, alert but not hostile. After a few quiet seconds, Ben squatted down and extended a hand. Not to touch, just to offer. Palm open, letting Echo decide. A long silence passed. Echo smelled rain, old ink, chalk dust, and sadness. The clean kind, from a boy without a father, whose mother worked in town all week. A loneliness without bitterness. And then something rare happened. Echo stepped forward, half a step, then tilted his head and placed his muzzle gently into the small, open palm. Thomas heard Echo's breathing change. He knew contact had been made. He nodded. "You just did something no one else has done all year. He let you touch him." Ben looked up, amazed. "Really? Really?" He doesn't let the vet touch his ears, not even the soldiers he served with. But he let you." Ben didn't know how to react. He just sat quietly. Echo withdrew his head, but didn't retreat. Then he lay down at Thomas's feet, head resting on the man's boot, tail flicking gently. From that day on, Ben began stopping by every afternoon, after school, before dusk. He wasn't loud, didn't ask too many questions. Sometimes he brought bread, sometimes a stick for Echo to sniff or nudge, but most of all, he became Thomas's eyes for the small things. "Is there smoke coming from the chimney?" "Yeah, a thin line, light gray, not black." "Is Echo sitting or lying down?" "He's lying on his side, one leg stretched, ears twitching at a car horn far off." "Did he lick his back left leg again?" "Yeah, but not anymore. I think it itches where new fur's growing." Ben wasn't a trainer, but he remembered everything with his heart. Like Echo, every tiny change he reported in honest, childlike words. "He dreamed something last night. I saw him shake, but he didn't bark." Or, "He didn't finish his bread today. I think he's sad." And Thomas, the man who once believed no one could see anything important anymore, suddenly saw everything through a child's words. Echo couldn't speak, Thomas couldn't see, but between them, Ben became the bridge, a thread not built on logic or skill, but instinct and unconditional kindness. One afternoon, when Thomas placed his hand on Echo's head, the dog didn't flinch. Thomas gently stroked him. Echo pressed his head into the palm, not from habit, but from trust. Ben watched through the window and knew. He wasn't just witnessing a dog reclaiming his past. He was helping a man recover his faith. And maybe, just maybe, he had found something too. A home. Late afternoon. The last light filtered through pine branches and touched the frosted window like a hand brushing over memory. Echo curled at Thomas's feet, head resting on the back of his hand, as if knowing tonight they would finally speak a truth never said aloud. Not to each other, but to strangers, to the wounded who had no one to listen to. Thomas gently touched the collar around Echo's neck, worn, cold like winter steel, but the faded inscription was still there. Echo, K9, never leave a comrade behind. He drew a long breath, the chill of metal mixing with warm flashes of firefights, the bark that rang before a raid, before a rescue, before every minefield step. And then, nothing. Years of believing Echo was dead. Now, miraculously, here he was, breathing, alive, resting his paw on the chest of the man he never truly left. Thomas rose and clipped a small voice recorder to his collar. Echo followed. A shadow. He knew this routine. When Thomas spoke to the silence, memories poured out. But tonight wasn't for keeping. It was for sharing. He sat at his desk, used voice command, open blog, new post, title, Echoes in the Snow. A pause. Then his voice filled the quiet cabin, not like a soldier recalling war, but like a whisper returned from deep woods. "I'm Thomas, blind, a former Special Forces operative, a survivor. Once, a man who had lost all reason to keep going. I had a comrade. His name was Echo. He wasn't human. He was a dog, a four-legged warrior. We stood side by side in battle, shared frozen bunks, ran through gunfire with one promise, leave no one behind." He paused, touched Echo, still beside him, ears twitching with every word. "Then one day they told me he went missing. No report, no ceremony, no one cared. I believed them. I said nothing. And for years, I wasn't just blind in sight, I was blind in faith." His voice dipped, then rose again, not with anger, but something gentler, deeper. "One winter night, I heard a whimper in the snow. So faint even the wind could have taken it. I followed it, and found him, half buried in ice, chained by rust, thrown away like war trash. I carried him home. I never saw his face, but my heart knew. This was my Echo." He spoke with no drama, no bitterness, just slowly, like water filling a cracked glass. "No one believed me, said he was just a stray that looked similar, but I didn't need proof. Just once, when he brought me seizure meds. I knew. Just once, when he walked on my left and lay beneath the table when the kettle whistled. I knew. Just once, when he let an orphaned boy pet his head. I knew. He paused long. Then, I used to think stories like this only existed in books, but maybe the truest ones aren't written. They've lived. He doesn't speak, but I hear him. He doesn't cry, but I feel every scar on his back. And he's never complained even though the world turned its back on him. Echo nestled into Thomas's lap, a warmth like flame. No need for light. Thomas felt exactly where his muzzle rested, over his heart. He said nothing more, just nodded, then whispered, "Publish the post." He reached over to the photo Ben had helped him take. A misty frame. Echo resting his head on Thomas's leg, the man sitting still as if listening to something very far away, or incredibly close. Thomas attached the photo to the post. Beneath it, he typed a single line. "We were both forgotten, but now we've found each other." That night, the snow fell heavily, but the blog post spread fast. Hundreds shared it in the first hour, then thousands. Comments poured in, from veterans, army nurses, old dog owners, and school kids. People who had never known war but understood abandonment. One old woman wrote, "I left a cat behind during the 1945 evacuation. I cried reading this." A young man messaged, "I was close to giving up. This post made me think maybe something's still worth coming back for." A retired K-9 handler wrote privately, "Thank you for saying what most of us carry but never speak. Echo isn't just a dog. He is us." In the wooden house, Thomas sat still. Echo slept, head on his leg. And Thomas knew. He was no longer blind. Not because he could see light again, but because his heart had found the most precious thing. A soul, loyal beyond all reason. That night, the Montana wilderness was eerily silent. Snow fell steadily like the slow, deep breaths of the earth, blanketing each wooden step and each gnarled pine branch outside the window. Inside the warm cabin, the fireplace cast shimmering rings of light onto the ceiling, like memories drifting gently back, not rushing, not urgent, but quietly reminding both man and dog of a past they had both tried to forget. Thomas sat in his old armchair, the microphone clipped to his collar long since turned off. Echo lay right beside him, his body resting on Thomas's legs, his breathing soft and steady, as if it had synced with the heartbeat of the blind man who had survived war through equal parts awareness and despair. The long day had come to a close, marked by the third post on the Echoes in the Snow blog, a place where long-buried memories were now spoken aloud, not for glory, but so someone, somewhere, might feel less alone. Outside, the wind blew lightly, too soft to stir the pine branches, but enough to scratch at the cabin walls with the lonely murmur of winter. Thomas was about to get up and check the back door when a strange sound sliced through his thoughts. A dry pop, not loud, but sharp enough to make Echo spring up. He didn't bark, but his ears perked, his whole body tensed, eyes fixed toward the kitchen. Thomas, though blind, sensed something was wrong. He sniffed the air. Something was slipping through it, acrid, sharp, and pungent, with the unmistakable stench of burning plastic. Then another pop rang out, closer this time. Echo moved, not hurriedly but deliberately, took 3 steps toward the hallway, then turned back, letting out a low growl. Not a fear. Warning. Thomas felt the first hint of smoke pass over his skin, like a fog seeping into memory. Then thickening. Heavier. Hotter. He pulled off his wool scarf, dampened it with the last of the water in his glass, and pressed it over his nose. "Echo, you have to lead me out," he whispered. No commands, no trained signals. Just trust, blind but solid as the spine of a man who once lay face down in firestorms and survived, thanks to the 4-legged anchor beside him. The Echo didn't respond with sound. He pressed his body firmly against Thomas's leg, nudged him sharply, as if to jolt every sense awake, then moved. Slowly, deliberately, his steps made a clear rhythm through the rising smoke. Thomas followed the sound, his right hand resting lightly on Echo's shoulder, his left sweeping the cane along a floor that was beginning to warm beneath him. The hallway narrowed, and the smoke thickened. Thomas coughed violently, his throat ablaze. His cane struck a fallen table leg. He stumbled, hit the floor hard, pain shooting from an old rib fracture. In that moment, suffocating, blind, and alone, a harsh breath sounded right next to his ear. Echo had returned, rubbing his body against Thomas again, nudging into his sleeve with his nose, gently lifting him, as if to carry the weight of his trembling friend. "You're here," Thomas whispered, nearly crying. They moved again. Echo guided him around the kitchen, now ablaze. The electric oven hissed like a wounded beast. The same kitchen where Echo once waited under the table each morning as Thomas made breakfast was now screaming with flames, dark smoke pouring from the cabinets like long-restrained fury. But Echo didn't look back. He just led, each step careful and precise, avoiding every obstacle, never letting Thomas trip, never letting him hesitate, never letting him fear. At the back door, Echo leapt up and pressed both front paws hard against it. The door gave way. Cold wind slapped their faces. Snow blew into the hall like the forest weeping, sharp and stinging. Thomas collapsed on the steps, choking and coughing. Echo stayed beside him, not licking his face like other dogs might, but lying down, pressing his body to Thomas's back, sharing warmth, anchoring them both. For several minutes they said nothing. Just wind, just crackling flames behind them, just the fierce, pounding heartbeats, in sync, man and dog, quietly united. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was ragged. "You still saved me, even without a command, even when I didn't know if you could." Echo lifted his head, eyes shining with something beyond words, not gratitude, but the gaze of a soul, granted another chance to live. The next morning, Ben came. He panicked at the sight of scorched skies and the blackened back door. Thomas told him everything. No embellishment, no dramatics, just what had happened. Ben said nothing for a long time. Then he bent down and hugged Echo. And Echo, just like that first night by the fire, didn't flinch. That evening, Thomas posted a new blog entry. No photo, no caption. "We survived again, not through instinct but through trust. He didn't ask why. He just knew I was the one he wouldn't leave behind." After the fire, the wooden cabin was quieter than ever, almost as if the smoke had soaked into its beams and floorboards, a silent reminder that survival is both a gift and a warning. Echo hadn't left Thomas's side since they'd escaped through the back door, not even in the days that followed, when the repair crew came, or when Ben and a few villagers arrived to help clear the acrid remains of the fire. Thomas didn't speak much, but every movement, every touch of his hand on Echo's head as the dog rested by the steps, every sigh as he opened the fireplace each night, carried a wordless sentiment, richer than any definition of gratitude. A week later, when the coughing had eased and the scent of smoke clung only faintly to the seams of his clothes, Thomas received a thick envelope. It was from a group he had only known by name, the Freedom K9 Rehabilitation Center. Inside was a formal letter with a handwritten line at the top. "Dear Mr. Thomas Gray, we have read your echoes in the Snow blog, listened to each of your recordings, and were deeply moved by the story of Echo, a four-legged warrior who not only survived, but became a symbol of loyalty in the shadows of memory. With the utmost respect, we invite you and Echo to visit Freedom K9, to allow Echo to serve as an honorary advisor, a companion, and, if possible, a silent teacher to the young K9s in rehabilitation for PTSD service. The decision is entirely yours. But know this, not just one, but hundreds of people need him. Sincerely, Dr. Anya Romero, Program Director, Freedom Canine. Thomas listened to each line through his speech-to-text reader. Slowly, quietly. Echo sat at his feet, head lifted, sensing the shift in the room. His ears alert, eyes fixed on Thomas, not blinking, not distracted but focused with uncanny intensity. Just like the old days, when he learned to read Thomas's thoughts not by sight, but by tone, by pauses, by breath. Thomas didn't respond right away. He simply folded the letter, set it on the table, and exhaled. A soft breath, like snow slipping through an open window. Ben, as usual, came by that afternoon. He read the letter, then sat in silence. He didn't say, "You should go," nor did he say, "Don't." Instead, he moved closer to Echo, gently stroking his now graying ears, and asked softly, "If Echo can help someone else like he helped you, should he go?" Thomas nodded. "That's what I've been asking myself." That night, after Ben left, Thomas sat in the quiet for a long while. He replayed an old recording, the one from the first time Echo pulled him out of a seizure. His voice then had trembled, but it was clear. "I don't need proof. That one act told me, you are Echo." Now, considering the invitation from Freedom K9, Thomas understood. They didn't want Echo just for his name, but for his actions, his calm, his reflexes, his gaze, and the heart that had never shut down. But the real ache didn't come from sharing Echo. It came from a deeply human question. Did he have the strength to let go of the only friend who had brought him back from the edge of death? Echo walked over and rested his head on Thomas's hand softly, like a suggestion. No barking, no urging, just a quiet touch. And Thomas understood. Echo was ready, if he agreed, and if not, Echo would stay, without resentment. The hard part wasn't the answer. The hard part was knowing that his blind heart had learned to live again, learned to trust because of Echo. Every step, every cup of tea, every snowy afternoon listening to the wind carried Echo's imprint. And if Echo left, could Thomas continue? Then he remembered something. Once, in the war zone, crouching together beneath a shot-up truck, Thomas had whispered, "If I don't make it, you have to go on. Help others, okay?" Echo hadn't understood the words. But in that moment, amid gunfire and dust, his eyes had seemed to agree. So why now, in peace, when Echo had the chance to do that again? Would Thomas hold him back? He reached up and touched the collar that had been polished recently, the one Ben had engraved just last week with a small new line. "A soul does not need light to lead the way." Thomas smiled. A sad smile, but free. "Maybe it's time for you to be more than just my light." That morning, the snow fell heavier than usual. The wooden cabin was veiled in a soft, milky white. The walls still held a faint scent of smoke, but now the space felt warm again, like a heart rekindled by stories finally spoken, by words that had once been buried. Echo lay on the porch, head resting on his front paws, his eyes fixed on the narrow trail winding down the mountainside. The very path Thomas had told the Freedom K9 organization they could come up at any time. Echo didn't seem anxious, nor did he sleep. The way he lay there, still, silent yet alert, resembled a soldier waiting for the final command in his final battle. Thomas, meanwhile, was different. Though his eyes no longer saw light, he heard everything. The wind seeping through cracks in the door, snow tapping the eaves, and Echo's steady breath from across the room. In his mind, every sensation felt amplified. The chill on his hands, the lingering scent of burnt wood, the blandness on his tongue, and deep down, a nameless void growing larger with every moment approaching their parting. Ben arrived early, carrying a handkerchief embroidered with the words, "Still here." No elaborate patterns, just 2 words slanted gently like a quiet vow. He said nothing as he placed the handkerchief on the table beside Echo's bed. He simply sat there, gently stroking Echo's head, as if trying to preserve a bit of warmth for something that was about to leave. The sound of an engine rumbled from a distance, steady, deep, and sure. Echo lifted his head. His ears perked up. Thomas noticed it too. There was no mistaking the vehicle. The organization's SUV had arrived. Everything in the cabin seemed to pause, time, sound, even the thoughts Thomas had tried to push aside night after night. The door opened. Dr. Anya Romero stepped out, the woman who had written the letter filled with hope, not only for Echo, but for the hundreds of veterans still battling memory and isolation. She brought no leash. She didn't call Echo's name. She simply stood beside the vehicle and extended her hand. A silent invitation. Never a command. Echo looked at her, then back at Thomas. No one spoke. There were no commands, no call, just a moment that stretched like a lifetime. Echo took a step forward. Dr. Romero smiled. Thomas stood straight, not signaling, not speaking, his breath caught in his chest, not from regret, but from fear that he might say something he shouldn't. Echo paused, then turned back. He stepped backward, 3 steps, then 4, not stopping at the porch, but walking to Thomas, lowering his head and resting it on his leg. No whimpering, no pleading, just a touch, gentle, steady, and so sincere that Thomas's heart trembled like a drum breaking open in his chest. His blind eyes seemed to light up with feeling, with understanding that needed neither sight nor words. That bowed head was not a refusal to leave. It was a conscious choice, to stay. Not because he lacked the courage to go, but because he knew exactly where he belonged. Ben, eyes glistening, stepped beside Echo and gently tied the handkerchief around his collar. He said nothing, but his reddened eyes spoke volumes. Gratitude, reverence, and a trace of forgiveness for Echo's choice. Dr. Romero stepped closer, her eyes softening. "I understand," she said quietly, bowing her head to Thomas and Echo. "Not every dog chooses to stay, and not every soldier has the strength to be chosen." The vehicle turned around and drove away. No dust, no horn, no farewell. Just the wind continuing to sweep under the eaves, carrying with it a thin veil of new snow, as if the sky too had accepted the silent decision. That night, by a newly kindled fire, Thomas brought the microphone close and recorded. "I used to think maybe one day I'd let you go to finish your journey. But today, when no one gave orders, when no one led the way, you turned back, laid your head on my leg, and stayed. Not out of debt, not out of pity, just because we weren't done yet. And to me, that's a promise stronger than any command, stronger than any victory, a promise made with the heart." The day Echo chose to stay, Thomas didn't cry. But that night, as the firelight cast shadows over Echo curled beside the chair, his chest rising and falling with a steady warmth, like a memory come back to life, Thomas understood. He was no longer a soldier left behind. He was someone holding a gift greater than survival, the loyalty that endures even after the impossible. From that embrace, from that unquestioning return, a thought began to grow. Slowly, but clearly. He couldn't live forever tucked inside this cabin, counting his and Echo's breaths like 2 beings cut off from the world. Somewhere out there, hundreds, if not thousands, of others like them had walked away from war zones, only to never truly return. So Thomas began. No big budget, no sponsors, just his hands, his ears still keen enough to hear unspoken pain, and Echo, the one soul who understood every silence. He named it Snow Haven, where the snow falls and spirits are held. At first, Snow Haven was nothing more than a repaired wooden cabin, a wide yard fenced with rough pine and a few handmade kennels. Thomas installed solar-powered heating and asked villagers for help building it up, none of whom asked for payment, because they'd all heard the story of Thomas and Echo, and because each of them carried a pain of their own that made them believe in miracles. Ben, ever the warm light nearby, became the chronicler of every first step. He asked his mother for 2 days off school. Each week, learned how to record Thomas's voice, edit simple videos, and launched a sub-blog under Echoes in the Snow, where he wrote about each new dog, each quiet veteran arriving at the refuge, each one, each story, like a leaf falling exactly where it needed to. The first dog to arrive was Rollo, a retired Doberman left behind after a paperwork error. He flinched at the sound of brooms, trembled at the sight of men in hats, until Echo approached him, didn't bark, just lay down in front of him, breathing softly, gently bringing his head close, but never pushing. For 3 days, Rollo didn't eat. On the 4th day, he fell asleep beside Echo. The first veteran to arrive was Daniel, a former scout soldier missing a leg and deep in PTSD after losing his closest friend, a K9 named Storm, to a mission gone wrong. He said nothing when he arrived. But when Echo looked up at him, as if recognizing him from somewhere, Daniel broke down on the porch. "He looks just like Storm," he whispered through tears. "But it's not just the look. It's the way he sees me, like he doesn't notice the prosthetic. He just sees that I'm still breathing." Day by day, Snowhaven grew into a map of healing, marked with scars, worn paths, and deep trenches, but never with anyone left behind. Thomas didn't need to see to understand. He learned to listen for tired footsteps, to tell panic breathing from peaceful breathing. And every time someone new arrived, it was always Echo who stepped forward first, not as a therapy dog, but as living proof. A dog once abandoned can rise again and become the light. One day, a reporter came to interview them. He asked, "Are you hoping to turn Snowhaven into a large center someday?" Thomas paused, then gently shook his head. "No," he said. "I just want it to be a porch wide enough for 2 scars to rest side by side. Whether it grows or not, that's not up to me." Echo, at that moment, lay by the door. He lifted his head, his deep eyes catching the late afternoon sun. He didn't need a title, didn't need a role, but to those who had lost everything, he was the reason they stood back up. No one taught Echo how to save people. It was simply his calm, his silent presence that made others find themselves again. And on cold evenings, with snow falling softly outside, Thomas would sit by the fire while Ben read aloud the latest blog entries. Echo lay between them, his head resting on Thomas's leg, occasionally twitching at a gust of wind, as if to remind them, even in this safe place, he remained the soldier keeping watch over restless souls. Late afternoon at Snowhaven. The final light of day faded behind the silent pine trees. The sky took on a thick ash-gray hue, like the dust of memories never quite brushed away, and the frozen lake behind the refuge lay still, like a blurred mirror, not only reflecting the cold sky, but also the deep loneliness of those who had walked through war and returned as breathing husks. Though his eyes no longer worked, Thomas could tell that something was different about that evening, not because of the wind or the air, but because Echo stood in front of the door for hours, unmoving, like a monument guarding a growing, invisible tension. He didn't bark, he didn't whine, but Thomas, his hearing sharpened by years, could sense something off in Echo's breathing, not panic, but a quiet vigilance that only comes from warriors who have once lost someone beside them. His name was Kyle. A young veteran was brought to Snowhaven just 3 days ago. He didn't talk much. His eyes were always fixed on some unseen point beyond the woods, where even the birds seemed too distant to matter. Every step he took was slow, heavy, like dragging a stone chained to the chest, forged in the years he wore the uniform. No one knew exactly what had happened, only that Kyle lost a comrade in an explosion, and since then he had stopped believing in weapons, in people, even in himself. Ben was the last to see Kyle. The boy said he had seen Kyle walking toward the lake, across the small wooden bridge no one ever used, the one covered in moss and brushed only by wind. Kyle had stood there for a long time, frozen, like a lost shadow caught between earth and sky. There was no need to ask more. Thomas understood. He didn't call for help, didn't panic. He simply placed a hand gently on Echo's back, a signal that needed no words. Echo rose immediately. No hesitation. No doubt. He dashed outside, cutting through the thin snow that lingered along the trail to the lake. His paws never slipped, He seemed to remember every gust of wind, every stone, every trace of cold that people usually overlooked. He wasn't searching. He knew where to go, because in his heart, souls on the brink always gave off a particular sound, a silence that carried weight, an absence that had shape. When Echo arrived, Kyle stood at the center of the lake, on a cracking layer of thin ice, head bowed, hands clenched tightly, gripping a decision long prepared. Around him, the frozen lake mirrored a sky stripped of blue, showing only streaks of bruised dusk. Not beautiful, just heartbreakingly cold. Echo didn't charge forward. He didn't bark. None of the trained instincts to rescue kicked in. He simply stopped at the edge of the lake, sat down, ears alert, eyes locked on Kyle. Not commanding, not pleading, just quietly present. Kyle heard the footsteps, then the breath. For a moment, he felt he was no longer alone. But instead of turning around, he closed his eyes, hoping it was only wind. But the breathing didn't fade. The warmth didn't vanish into the freezing air. He had to look. And when his gaze met those deep brown eyes, something inside him cracked. Not the ice, but a hardened shell of emotional numbness. Echo did nothing. He just sat, steady, silent, patient. And it was that stillness that broke Kyle. The tears fell, tears he hadn't let fall since coming home, since burying his comrade, since surviving in a way that felt like betrayal. He dropped to his knees. The ice didn't break, but his heart, beside a creature once abandoned and now returned to purpose, began to tremble. Echo moved closer, slowly, each step careful, as if not to shatter the final fragments left. When he reached Kyle, he touched his shoulder just lightly. No licking, no nudging. He simply lay beside him, breathing evenly, as if to say, "I've stood where you are. I too waited for someone to call my name, but I was found. And now I will stay if you want to find yourself again." Thomas arrived later. Slowly. His hands traced each branch so as not to disturb the moment. He didn't call out. He simply sat beside Echo, the war-scarred companion who never needed a bark to prove loyalty. Three beings, one man who could not see light, one young soldier ready to leave it, and one dog once buried under cold silence, sat together in the vast, still wilderness without a single word. And in that stillness, a life was held back, not by reason, but by the pure weight of presence. Snow still fell lightly around Snowhaven, each flake landing gently on the cabin roof, melting quickly, like wishes for peace never quite said aloud. But the chill in Thomas's chest didn't come from the wind. It came from a letter delivered by the town's police officer, stiff, formal, sealed in red like a cold verdict. Cease operation of Snowhaven immediately due to public safety concerns. The congregation of individuals with war trauma and working dogs in a residential area poses a potential risk for disturbances and psychological harm to the community. Thomas let his screen reader voice out the words. The mechanical, emotionless tone cut deeper than shouting ever could. He didn't need to look to know where Echo was, always on his left, quiet as breath, part of his body, a soul never needing a reason to stay loyal. When the voice stopped, Echo shifted slightly, resting his head on Thomas's leg, as if sensing the weight in each breath. Ben stood by the window, his small hands clenched tightly at the hem of his sweater, his voice shaking as he reread the letter aloud. "They said we're a danger," the boy said, eyes on Echo. "Because of dogs like him?" Echo lifted his head. His gaze on Ben wasn't sad, just deep, as if he'd heard it before. As if he'd once been accused, rejected, buried alive. Thomas didn't react with anger. Instead of fighting back, he reached gently to Echo's neck, where faint scars from his service days still lingered. "We don't argue to prove who we are, Echo," he whispered, softly enough only someone who's fought in silence could understand. "We'll go, we'll speak, not to be accepted, but so they know who we are." 3 days later, the hearing took place in the town's small assembly hall. The room wasn't large, but it was packed with eyes that were curious, uneasy, sometimes afraid. Echo entered without a leash. As always, he walked to Thomas's left, not a step out of sync. Back straight, head lowered, gaze unfixed on anyone yet drawing every eye to him. A middle-aged woman stood up first. Her voice trembled slightly, but was clear. "I'm not saying you don't deserve help, but is it safe to have people with PTSD and large dogs in a residential area? What if they lose control? What if a child gets bitten? Who takes responsibility?" Thomas stood, calm, unhurried. He inhaled once, deep, then let Echo lie down at his feet, like a period at the end of a sentence made of trust. "I can't see your face," he began, voice steady, not loud, but firm. "I'm blind, but I know someone in this room sees us as a threat, just like Echo once was, chained up, buried in snow, left behind. But it was he, not a person, saved my life. He got my meds during a seizure. No one taught him that after he was abandoned, but he remembered. Because for the loyal ones, loyalty isn't trained. It's grown in love and survives in memory." The room quieted. Echo slowly lifted his head. He didn't look at anyone in particular, just forward, as if his gaze was piercing through layers of doubt. "I ask you," Thomas continued, "if your son had served and came back so shaken that he couldn't sleep more than 2 hours a night, couldn't leave the house because thunder sounded like bombs, would you want him in silence or in a place where someone understands him? And a dog who doesn't speak but never leaves?" Somewhere in the back, a child cried, but no one left. Ben slowly raised his hand, without waiting to be called. "I'm not a veteran," he said, his voice still young but steady. "I lost my dad when I was 6. I know what it feels like to lose someone. But Echo didn't let anyone else get lost. He saved Mr. Thomas. He saved Kyle. I think he saved me too, from growing up not knowing what loyalty means." Echo stood up. He took one step, then another, and stopped in front of the woman who had just spoken. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't nuzzle. He simply sat, eyes forward, silent, like a living testament, that sometimes the very thing people fear most is the only one that doesn't turn away when we fall. Margaret, the woman, flinched slightly, but then let her hand fall gently. She placed it softly on Echo's head, a small gesture. But in that instant, the room fell as silent as if snow had just stopped falling. No conclusion was made that day, but no one left the meeting the same as they had entered. No more demands to shut the place down. No more fearful whispers. Only silence and Echo's quiet presence, like a rest note in a song that had, for too long, been all noise. As they stepped out of the town hall, Thomas gently placed a hand on Ben's shoulder and said softly, "We haven't been approved yet, but today people started to listen." Ben looked at Echo, the dog still walking on the left, his shadow stretching long across the snow, and whispered, almost to himself, "I think that was the first time I saw a dog walk into a courtroom and make everyone go silent, not out of fear, but because they were listening with their hearts." The snow had stopped falling over Snowhaven, but within Thomas another storm rumbled, one not of sky and weather, but of prejudice, waiting outside, ready to wipe out everything they had built with a single signature. Since the last hearing, the town council had yet to make a final decision. Margaret's eyes, the ones once most filled with opposition, had softened. Public perception had thawed somewhat. But law was still law, and Snowhaven still stood on the brink of forced closure. A second public hearing was called, this time with the presence of local reporters, television crews, and representatives from City Hall. Outside, the wind cut across faces. Inside, hearts had not yet fully warmed. Thomas sat in the front row. Echo lay beneath him, his head resting on Thomas's familiar left foot, the place he always chose, where he could feel every movement of the blind man. Thomas couldn't see the scrutinizing stares sweeping over him, but he could feel the murmurs. Not all were against them, but not all understood. The final voice on the list to speak was soft but clear. It was Kyle. He wore his old uniform, neatly pressed, no medals added, just the proud, straight posture of a man who had once wanted to die, but had learned to live again. He walked slowly, holding Echo's leash, a dark khaki strap held loosely, not as a restraint, but like guiding a friend, not a beast. Cameras clicked, lawyers opened folders, skeptics shifted in their seats. But Kyle didn't speak at once. He simply knelt, right there in the crowded room, under the lights, under surprised eyes, and placed a hand on Echo's chest. "This dog," he began, voice trembling but steady, "sat in front of me when I was ready to end my life. He didn't bark. He didn't stop me. He just showed up. And that was the first time I felt someone chose to stay beside me for no reason." Echo didn't move. He simply closed his eyes, as if understanding that the words spoken weren't to persuade, but to affirm. Kyle turned towards the council, his eyes clear, bright, and honest like a sacred vow. "I was a soldier once, and I know. Not everyone survives war in one piece, but places like Snow Haven are the only places where we learn to breathe again without shame. That blind man, Thomas, he never even saw me, but he was the first to believe I still had worth." He paused, then slowly turned to Echo and wrapped his arms around the dog's neck. "And this dog was the first to forgive me when I couldn't forgive myself." A heavy silence fell over the room. No pages turned, no chairs squeaked. Even the air seemed to be still, thick with raw emotion. One by one, people stopped moving. Not because they'd been convinced, but because they were witnessing something so painfully real, so honest, it needed no further words. The government attorney, who had been silently observing from the start, suddenly closed the folder before him. The sound echoed through the quiet like an exclamation mark. "There's nothing more to hear," he said, voice lowered, hand resting gently on the closed file. "The motion to shut down the center will be withdrawn." Thomas couldn't see it, but he heard the soft exhale from Kyle, as if a weight had finally dropped from his shoulders. Echo didn't move, but in the slight tilt of his head, the deeper rhythm of his breath, the light that flickered in his eyes beneath a thick coat of fur, something had fallen. Not a tear, but something even rarer. Rebirth. No one clapped. There was no need. In that moment, no one wanted to celebrate. They just wanted to be still, to honor a life that had just been reclaimed, not by authority, but by compassion. On the walk back, Kyle walked slowly beside Thomas. No one spoke. Echo walked between them. No leash held him. Only warmth, shared between two hands that had once trembled, once gone cold, once touched rock bottom, now walking together through a snowless day. That morning, the ground still held Echo's footprints from the day of the hearing. The snow hadn't yet covered them, as if winter itself was lingering, wanting to preserve what had happened. The steps of a silent dog who saved lives, not by biting, not by barking, but by softening the hardest hearts. Thomas sat on the porch, hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea. Echo lay at his feet, as always. There was no place he needed to be more. The breeze was light, the pines whispering their ancient songs from the Montana wilderness. And then another sound joined in. Soft, fragile, so easily lost if not for the way Echo suddenly sprang up. Just one movement, a tilt of the ear. Thomas sensed the change in Echo's stance. He didn't bark, only stood still, his breath tightening. Then a faint whimper came from the gate, the very gate where so many lost souls had first arrived at Snow Haven. Ben was the first to run out. He returned quickly, breath short, voice hushed as if afraid to startle something delicate. "Uncle Thomas, there's a puppy at the gate. He's tiny, skin and bones. But right in the middle of his chest there's a patch of fur shaped like a star." Echo had already begun walking. Not fast, but without hesitation. Thomas placed a hand on Ben's shoulder, letting him lead. And when they reached the gate, the puppy was sitting there, legs trembling, but his eyes were not. He wasn't begging. He didn't wag his tail. He simply looked up, jet black eyes, deep and unnervingly still. Echo stopped in front of the little creature. For a breathless moment, the two dogs, one old, one new, gazed at each other as if exchanging truths too profound for humans to ever write. Thomas approached, slowly kneeling, hands gently reaching through the air until they touched a wet, shivering nose. The puppy didn't back away. He sat still. Thomas raised his hand to the pup's chest and paused. There it was, a patch of white fur, irregular but clear, shaped like a star, as if time itself had left a mark. Just like Echo used to be, Ben whispered, crouching beside Thomas. No barking, no asking, but he knows he belongs. Here. Echo stepped forward, not with his eyes, but with his breath. He lowered his head and touched his nose to the puppy's forehead. A slow movement, not one of dominance, but of ritual, of acceptance. The little one quietly tilted his head, then placed one paw on Echo's. Awkward, tiny, but full of trust, as if to say, if this is a place for those with nowhere left to go, then I'd like to stay. Thomas, Ben, and Echo didn't need to discuss. No decision had to be made. They simply opened the gate, and the puppy, without a single sound, stepped into Snowhaven as if he had always belonged. That day, Thomas gave him a name, Nova, from the Latin, meaning new star. Because, he said, brushing a finger over the star-shaped patch of fur, every lost soul deserves a chance to shine. And dogs like Echo shouldn't be the end of a legacy, but the beginning of something eternal. Echo stood beside Nova, taller, stronger, but not imposing. He simply sat, letting Nova find his way into this world, a world with no yelling, no harsh commands, only presence, trust, and quiet touches that beat like a heart. That night, for the first time in years, Echo didn't lie by Thomas's feet. He lay next to Nova, like a teacher who used no words, only presence, to protect, to watch, and to pass on a mission he had carried his whole life, unseen. And when Ben lifted his camera to capture the moment, firelight flickering inside the cabin, Nova curled against Echo, Thomas sitting behind them, eyes blind but heart seeing clearly. He typed the first caption into a new journal. We don't rescue dogs. These four-legged souls are teaching us how to be human, bit by bit, through generations that need no final words. Night settled over Snowhaven like a dark wool blanket, carrying the scent of damp pine and leftover smoke from dinner. Inside the small wooden cabin, the fire no longer crackled with daytime energy. It had softened, casting a warm, flickering glow that made room for stillness. Not a stillness that spoke of loneliness, but one that invited pause, to listen to the tiny rhythms of life moving gently beneath the quiet. Echo didn't sleep as he usually did. He wasn't lying in his usual spot at Thomas's feet, nor resting his head on the thick mat Ben always laid out just for him. Instead, he stretched out by the fireplace, the warmest place in the room, and allowed the newly arrived pup, Nova, to curl into the curve of his back like a sprout seeking shelter in old soil. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He wasn't on alert. Even when Nova, half asleep, nestled deeper into the gray, streaked fur along his flank, Echo didn't stir. His breathing remained steady, warm, and grounded, as if, in that moment, Echo was offering the most sacred thing a soul could leave behind, a sense of safety. Thomas sat across the room, holding a cup of cold tea. Though his blind eyes could not see, his heart followed with unerring clarity, a heart more finely attuned than any eyes that had once served him in battle. He didn't need to touch Echo to know he was awake. He didn't need to hear Nova's breathing to know the pup was in deep sleep. Some things don't require confirmation through the senses, because they're felt through love. Ben sat curled in a chair across from them, chin resting on his arms, watching the scene before him as if afraid even breath might disturb it. He whispered, voice low as the fire's glow, "I've never seen him like that." Thomas smiled. A smile not in the eyes, but at the corner of his lips. Echo doesn't teach with commands. He teaches by being there. When you need him, when you're weak, even when you don't realize you need to be loved. Ben nodded, his fingers tracing shapes across his knees, like writing a new journal entry in his mind. "So do you think he's telling Nova, 'You'll be okay?'" Thomas shook his head gently. "No," he's saying, "no matter what happens, I won't leave." By the fire, Nova stirred slightly, stretching his tiny legs back, one paw reaching and resting against Echo's belly. Echo tilted his head, let out a soft sigh, then stayed as he was, not in discomfort, but in acceptance. The presence of the young pup didn't diminish him. It made it clearer than ever that a part of his soul was ready to live on in another form. Wind howled beyond the eaves. Snow began falling again. But inside that room, warmth spread like a great embrace, wrapping around 3 lives not bound by blood: a blind soldier, a dog once betrayed but never broken, and a fragile new spirit shaped like hope. And that night, the first night Nova slept soundly beside Echo, was also the first in many years that Thomas dreamed not of gunfire or battlefields or loss, but of a snowy field where Echo ran ahead, Nova followed close behind, and he, though unable to see, knew with absolute certainty that he was home. That morning, the sky held no pink, no gold. It simply lightened, slowly, cold and quiet, like the breath of someone reluctant to wake. The snowfall from the night before had stopped, leaving a pristine white layer across the steps, the trees, and the narrow trail to the small yard behind the cabin, where Thomas usually sat each morning. Tea in hand, Echo at his feet, Nova beside them, and Ben yawning in the doorway like a ritual greeting the day. But this morning, Echo didn't wait to be woken. He had risen before everyone, soundlessly, without waiting for a signal. He stood slowly, a little heavily, as if every bone in his body already knew what was coming. But he wasn't afraid. He simply walked to Thomas, who was still dreaming his quiet dreams, and gently touched his nose to the man's hand. Thomas stirred, not to barking, but to presence, that quiet call Echo always carried. "Echo," he whispered. The dog touched his hand again, softly, and like always, Thomas understood. There were no questions. Where or why? He just stood, pulled on a thick sweater, and placed his hand on Echo's back. Nova opened his eyes from the straw by the fireplace, tilted his head, made no sound, and didn't follow. He simply watched, as if sensing he hadn't been invited into this chapter of the story yet. Echo led Thomas to the backyard. Each step left a deeper imprint than usual, not because the snow was heavier, but because Echo's body was. Slower, weighted, perhaps by all the winters he now carried inside. Still, he walked evenly. No hesitation, no faltering, because there was one thing he had never done: stop protecting. Thomas followed Echo's steps like a blind man tracing the rhythm of his own heart. When they reached the wooden bench beneath the old pine trees, Echo paused, waited for Thomas to sit, then slowly lay down at his feet, in the same familiar place, the one where Thomas had once collapsed, had once been saved, had once whispered "Echo" in the darkest hours of his life. Thomas took a deep breath. The air was cold, but not sharp. The sky was gray, but not heavy. He didn't know why Echo had brought him here this morning, but he didn't ask. For the most important things, Thomas understood. The reason didn't matter. Only the moment did. Below him, Echo lay on his side, head nestled against the toe of Thomas's left boot, just like always. But this time he didn't close his eyes right away. He lifted his head slightly, looked up at the pale gray sky, no birds, no sun, and let out a breath, not the breath of a creature at the end of its strength, but the breath of a soul who had fulfilled its purpose. Ben appeared at the door, hesitated, then chose not to speak. Nova followed slowly, not running. He walked to Echo, sat down, didn't press into the space between dog and man. He simply lay one step away, close enough to hear Echo's breath, far enough to honor it. And then Echo closed his eyes. No sound, no thud, no labored gasp. just the silence of something that once burned brightly, now settling gently like warm ash at the bottom of a fire. Thomas sat for a long time, hand still around his cooling cup of tea. He didn't know Echo had passed, not in the usual sense, but he knew something had left, something that couldn't be named or touched, but had been the pillar of his existence. Ben walked over and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Uncle Echo's sleeping, right?" Thomas didn't answer, but the corner of his mouth lifted. Not a smile, but a thank you. Nova stayed still. He didn't bark, but he looked at Echo for a long time, as if carving into memory that final position, the way a teacher, a warrior, a friend, chose to leave quietly in place without regret. That was the last time Echo stood, and from that moment on his shadow no longer fell across the snow, but somehow his steps would still lead him home, to the place called Snow Haven, to the place where loyalty never dies. Snow fell again that night, as if the sky wished to lay a final blanket over the loyal soldier who had just completed his last mission. Thomas said nothing all evening. He simply sat beside Echo's body, his hand gently resting on fur that had grown cold, but still felt as soft as the first time they met in the snowy woods years ago. Nova lay not far away, not crying, not barking, but his eyes were wide open through the night, as if he were absorbing Echo's final lesson, how to wait in silence. The next morning, Ben carried a large block of ice into the yard. No one asked, no one taught him, but he knew what had to be done, because it was the only thing his heart urged, to carve Echo into something that could be seen, could be touched, could be embraced, even if only once more. With a small knife, a file, bare hands, and breath that fogged in the cold, Ben carefully sculpted a statue of Echo, right by the wooden gate of Snow Haven, where Echo had once led so many lost souls into the light. He didn't carve Echo running. He didn't sculpt Echo with his head held proudly. He captured that final moment, Echo lying on his side beneath Thomas's feet, eyes closed, body at peace, as if dreaming a long dream untouched by pain. Ben never explained why he chose that pose, but Thomas, tracing the cold surface with his fingers, smiled. He'd want to be remembered in that silence, not in the sound of medals. The news spread faster than they expected. Within days, those who had once been touched by Echo, physically or in those moments when no words could reach, began to arrive at Snow Haven. They didn't come to cry. They came to stand still, to look at the shimmering statue under the biting sun, and to remember they had once been saved. A young man bearing a tattoo of Echo's collar, an elderly woman who once trembled on a park bench, with Echo lying beside her for 3 hours, unmoving, a veteran who had nearly ended his life, and because of Echo, saw the Montana sky for the first time again. They made no noise. There was no crowd. Each came at their hour. Each placed a hand on the statue, held it there for a moment, as if passing a part of their once broken heart into the ice. Nova stayed back, sitting quietly, not drawing attention. But then, when a slant of sunlight hit just right and made the statue glow like silver, he stepped forward. He didn't use his paw. He didn't yet know how. He simply pressed his forehead gently against the foot of the ice statue, right where Echo had lain, just the way Echo had greeted him on their first day. Then he stepped back, returned to Thomas's side, and sat waiting. No command needed. That night, Ben recorded the memorial in just a few quiet lines. "We didn't build this statue to mourn. We built it to remember how a dog, who said nothing, still managed to save the world, through loyalty and the warmth of waiting." Snow kept falling, soft as chalk dust, glistening under the late afternoon sun as Thomas, wearing a worn wool sweater and holding his familiar wooden cane, slowly made his way toward the front gate of Snow Haven. Ben didn't follow. Neither did Nova. The entire refuge seemed to hold its breath, giving space to a moment everyone understood wasn't a ceremony, but a final touch, and something eternal. Thomas stopped in front of the statue. The cold from the ice seeped through his thin gloves, but he didn't pull away. His hand moved gently across the sculpted body, formed with simple yet precise lines, as if tracing a memory turned to stone. His fingers reached the muzzle of Echo, the same spot where Echo had rested his head on Thomas's hand that final morning. No words had been spoken then, but everything had been understood. Thomas tilted his head. No tears. Just one quiet breath. Then, in a whisper so soft it might have been mistaken for wind passing through snow, he said, "I don't need to see you, because I've always known you're here." The wind paused, as if listening. Snowflakes hung briefly in midair, then drifted down more slowly, more gently, like they too were afraid of breaking something sacred and fragile between man and ice. From a distance, Ben stood in the doorway of the cabin, camera in hand. Nova sat beside him, head slightly tilted, watching Thomas's silhouette. No one moved. No one broke the silence. The camera began to pull back, step by step, like someone quietly retreating from a temple after offering their full-hearted prayer. The wider view appeared. Snowhaven nestled in a blanket of white, cradled by tall pines. The rooftops looked like soft waves of peace. At the gate stood the statue of Echo. Not tall, not grand, just high enough that anyone passing by would need to bow to touch it, to remember, and to say thank you. And Echo, somehow, was still there. Not in the statue, not in the snow, but in every touch, every bowed head, every quiet glance that found its way back to this place whenever someone needed to believe again. To remember that loyalty doesn't die, that faith doesn't vanish, and that love, when guarded in silence, will never fade. On screen, a simple line appeared. Echo was never just a name. He was the answer for anyone who thought they were lost forever in silence. The last light of day slid across the frozen sculpture, casting a soft rainbow over Echo's muzzle. Nova stepped forward and sat beside Thomas. Not called, not commanded, as if Echo himself had whispered something into his ear. And in the final frame, they remained. A blind man, a young dog, a statue of ice, and a white winter sky, silent, still, but more complete than any spoken goodbye could ever be. Maybe all of us have walked through our stretches of frozen snow, times when the light vanished, when hope scattered like dust in the wind. But in the darkest moments, sometimes all it takes is a quiet touch, a wordless gaze, or the simple presence of a loyal soul to become the only flame that keeps us going. Have you ever met your own echo? Someone, or something, that kept you alive through a day you thought would break you? Share your story in the comments, because maybe your echo could become someone else's light. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so we can keep spreading stories of friendship, loyalty, and the kind of faith that never fades. Thank you for walking with Echo, and with all the souls who never left our side. We'll see you again, on the other side of silence.